episode 112 going out to you sometime. Well, today is the 23rd of October, so it's one day after the great reopening, which we witnessed horrifically through somebody putting up on Twitter last night the queue outside Copperface Jack's. So that was mightily impressive. And it looks like we're continuing to have to do these plague tapes, because it doesn't look like this exit strategy is much of an exit at the moment. Does it, Andrew?
No, it's more kind of accelerating into a wall to see what happens, I think, is what the current strategy looks a bit like.
That doesn't sound like an exit, alright. Yeah. Will we break through the wall, or will we just splatter all over? Yeah.
I mean, God, I think I said last week that they clearly shouldn't go ahead with the opening, but I reckon they probably would, just because politicians
and they seem to be,
and so
exactly
we had our first NPHET press conference during the week, and our first HSE one since, I think, late August was the last ones, with the NPHET one them saying that they would be probably doing more briefings in the future. So that's an acknowledgement that the initial plan obviously hasn't succeeded. And the last 2 days we've had over 2,400 cases in each day. So if you remember December,
2,400 cases, right?
Last December, I think we didn't hit those numbers until early January, right? In fact, the reporting system wasn't capable of dealing with more than 1,600 cases back then, so they had to do an emergency rewrite of procedures in order to get it. So that's kind of a starting position, is that number. And unfortunately, it has translated into hospitalizations and ICU admissions, with ICU today is up to 93. So that's up from about 63 maybe about a week to 10 days ago. And then a certain amount of bouncing around 70. And the south and the west of the country, there are essentially no ICUs available the last couple of days. So if you have a bad car accident down there, they're going to have to transport you up to the Midlands or Dublin. There's elective surgery is being cancelled in hospitals, and paediatric hospitals, interestingly enough, even though it's rare enough for kids to be hospitalised, there have been 3 in ICU over the course of the last month, I think. And because of the other viruses in circulation, there's no ICUs available there either. It seems a little crazy that you would push ahead at 90, now 93 ICUs in use. Previous lockdowns were called at sort of between 35 and 50 ICUs, I think, being in use. And although the rate of increase is slower, it's not that insignificant.
If it's going like
yesterday's 90 were 123% of the previous Friday, so there's an actual concrete figure.
Okay, yeah. Look, 123%, but even from going from 60 to 90, I don't need to be a genius at maths to go like that's a third. That's an increase of a third in the space of a week.
Well, no, it's a bit more than a week. It's sort of, that's over 2.5 to 3 weeks, I think. It's bounced around. Basically, it bounced between 60 and 70 for a long time,
right?
And then it's more recently gone up a lot more.
Okay, but then even pulling back from, I know we're in a kind of unique situation in terms of vaccination figures and everything else, but front page of The Guardian today, UK sleepwalking into winter of COVID chaos, unions warn. And then if you go into the paper itself, you'll see full-size ads taken out by the unions saying you have to do something about this. And then on the front page of the Financial Times is UK recalls jabs chief to front line. So she was pulled away to policy, now she's gone back into pandemic stuff. So this is happening all over, and in that context, we decided to go ahead with the reopening.
Yeah, it's happening all over Europe actually. Most countries in Europe got cases far lower first, so although they're also seeing substantial case increases, they're doing so for a fifth or a quarter of our level. So that means we're in trouble. They've another couple of weeks basically before they get to the situation we're in at the moment. And then in some countries with low vaccination rates, particularly Romania, it's really bad. You know, they're now having to transfer ICU patients across the border to Hungary, and yeah, so there's going to be a major crisis across Europe of healthcare systems.
So where's our health system in all of this? I mean, how quickly is it going to?
It is in crisis. I mean,
Yeah,
it
it's
is.
already in crisis.
It's not. Yeah. It wasn't. I mean, even if you didn't have the COVID issue, it would be in crisis anyway. It is in most. Well, it's not normally by now in most winters, but there's a particularly large backlog of care because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So they're trying to process that. Then they have COVID on top of it, and then we've also seen a return of other viruses, in particular the norovirus, the winter vomiting bug. That's quite interesting. They use that as an example at the NPHET press conference, because it's kind of a proxy that tells you socialization has returned to something like normal, because that's now back to normal levels. Now, it could be that there's a bit less immunity out there because it wasn't around at all during the pandemic. So it may not indicate a return to absolutely normal levels, but you know, it does suggest that the wave of COVID we're seeing is basically a product of socialization getting back towards something that's quite like normal.
Yeah.
You know, people in work, all the different
You can see it.
changes
I
we've
mean,
seen.
you can see it. I was out not last weekend so much, but then a couple of weekends before that, and it was already. I mean, people were. I think this is an issue in terms of the normalization, getting back to normal, that whole narrative. I mean, people bought into that because there's an absolute yearning to get back into society, and now it's continuing. But in all of this, it seems absolutely ludicrous that they opened up nightclubs last night. And like, can you give us some detail around, because I haven't been following it, but it doesn't look like there's any real restrictions. What exactly have they given? Like in terms of
It's actually
assurances?
so the industry's kind of gone nuts today, right?
Right.
And that seems to be mostly because they've told them that everybody has to be ticketed from next week. So you have to turn up with a ticket. You can't just get in on the door.
All right, so you can't have the scenes like we saw last night, with queues gone down hardcore.
So I mean, the interesting thing about the Copperface Jack's queue is, my understanding was that as part of getting to reopen, the industry had assured they were going to do it in a safe way, and that safety was going to include managing distancing at queues. Now, I'm not 100% sure of that, right? That's what I thought was going to be happening. And in which case, given that basically every journalist in the country was at Copperface Jack's to cover its opening last night, I think it's fairly indicative of the level of bullshit involved in this process, that couldn't be done. And in fact, that queue that existed there seems to be there from about 8 o'clock in the evening, because obviously people
the thing that I saw was like 9 o'clock. It was 9 o'clock, and it was going down half the street.
And an awful lot of it seems to be set up so that in a month's time, the government can blame punters, first of all, for going, even though they've been told it's safe. This is exactly what they pulled.
Personal responsibility.
Yeah, this exactly what they pulled in December, basically.
Yeah.
Where they then turned around and tried to blame us because we'd done the thing that they said was safe. They blame punters, and probably secondary actually will probably pick some scapegoats in terms of the industry and blame them for particularly badly managing things, you know, and try and survive the backlash if this goes as wrong as it might, right? That way, like that seems to be the way it's all set up. So they've had, and the particular reason I'm saying that is Catherine Martin, who's the minister involved here, during the press conference announced it all. Had this.
Okay, so she's a Green, isn't she?
She's Green Party. Yeah. They've been useless throughout the pandemic.
As if you had any expectations of anything else.
I mean, you know, my expectations would have been low with them, but
they've
doesn't
gone
even make
lower
sense.
than their expectations.
This doesn't even make sense. You know, the pandemic stuff just doesn't make sense, because if anything, they could have taken advantage of it to push through Green Party policy a bit, particularly on flights, you know, flying. But anyway, I've ranted about that before. But anyway, so she came up with this great line about how there would have to be personal responsibility and people would have to socially distance while queuing for the bar. And you're going, I mean...
So and people are in charge of themselves, like in terms of
but also the idea that the idea that the problem would be the queue for the bar in itself was kind of a bizarre idea, or the idea that, I mean, anybody who's gone to a nightclub means, you know, I mean, people arrive drunk.
Yes.
That's what you do. Frequently, people have taken drugs as well. They're about as capable or intending to engage in personal responsibility. I mean, the whole point
It's
of a nightclub
yes.
is an escape from personal responsibility. I mean,
Totally.
that's what people
Yeah.
do. They go there to get plastered, to hook up with people, to do lots of things that are, not... they're not a definition of personal responsibility, even in the general day-to-day sense. It's absolutely crazy to imagine that.
Yeah,
it's
like asking for personal responsibility in an adult playpen. That's basically what it is. But like, just to add to this, like, this is
and on top of that, this is mostly young people who've been pretty bottled up for 17 months now or whatever. So of course you got to go out and go absolutely crazy. Like, it's just the dishonesty of... I actually mind the dishonesty of the rhetoric coming from the politicians around this, and the fact that it's explicitly setting people up so that when people get sick, when people can't get hospital care, when people's parents or grandparents or vulnerable friends die, because that is part of what this will mean, that the government will then turn around and say, well, that's your fault because you had too many Jägermeisters and, snogged 12 people on the dance floor or something.
You didn't keep your distance in the queue.
Yeah. It's a complete setup that, of course, people are walking into. I think the copper-faced things, Jack's thing amuses me because it's just going, Jesus, imagine going to copper-faced Jack's and that's where you get COVID. What the fucking... It's not even like it's an experience I could go, it's a great club.
Once in a lifetime experience.
Yeah. That's just, oh man, that's just layer of crap.
We wouldn't know though. We'd never really been. This is from Noel Rock, who was a TD. I don't think he's a TD any longer. His tweet last night is, Dublin is absolutely buzzing tonight. It's sort of fantastic. Hopefully it's an enduring view of the world we once had rather than a fleeting glimpse. Even within their own bullshit, they recognise that this is ludicrous. Like, not to put it's obviously going to be a fleeting glimpse if you actually look at anything like the healthcare system, the pressure that people are under. 2,400 cases a day, 100 and what is it up on from last week's cases? Or we had 123% or 140% of last week's cases?
It's about 100. So I've got it down as 146 of previous. I wonder if that's a typo on my part, though. I didn't think it had gone up that much. No, it couldn't have.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a typo.
Okay,
so Fridays were 129% of the previous Friday.
Yeah, okay.
And the swabs are 126%. Swabs is 122% over 3 day average. Yeah.
And we've also got
there.
And then the prevalence of the actual virus itself is well over 500, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So that's 500 per 100,000. Isn't it? Yeah.
It's about 540, I think, now. So yeah, I mean, like
we open up nightclubs at that moment.
All the measures are yeah. And as I said, the problem is this is turning into people going to hospital. It is turning into ICU admissions, and we now know there were at least 155 deaths in September. That's probably going to increase. So you're pretty much at near to 40 a week now. Probably was actually 40 a week by the time you get all the figures in. So, these are all significant numbers. October is well on course for there being over 200 deaths, I'd say, at this stage. Even without any of these changes haven't happened. So, there are consequences to all this, right?
So tell me about the structure. Tell me about how everything is coming back together again. We've got NPHET press conferences.
Yeah.
I presume we're going to have politicians now.
So let me do a yes but on this first of all, right? Because there's a counter argument, so I'm going to give what the counter argument is, and then I'm going to say why I don't think it works particularly well, right? The counter argument is the kind of, what else are we going to do? We've lived under restrictions for a really long period of time. Most people have done what they were asked to do. Most people have gone and got vaccinated. We've a tiny proportion of the population, of the adult population, less than 8% of adults who have basically refused to get vaccinated. And are we staying locked down to protect that 8% of people who, just refuse to get vaccinated, despite the fact that that's what we need to stay open, right?
Yeah.
And, so there's some people see this almost as a punishment of them. We're going to open up, then those people some of them are going to get sick. And that will solve the problem, because then there'll be enough population immunity and the problem will go away. Right?
Doesn't feel like it's targeted like that, really.
And so and there's, to a certain extent, NPHET showed their projections for what they think is going to happen, right? And what they think is going to happen is cases are going to go up, hospitalizations are going to go up, ICU will go up, they didn't have one for deaths, and that will peak at the end of November, right? Presumably the only reason there's a peak at the end of November is they think at that stage enough people will have been infected that that will slow the pandemic down and we will actually come off peak. So that kind of looks like they're expecting a critical level of population immunity to be reached through infection, basically, by the end of November. That, it's like it's not what they said, but they didn't explain why it was going to peak there.
Right.
So therefore, they have to expect something to be happening at that point in time, and that's the only thing you could logically expect to be happening. It's about the right timing as well, right?
So this is like a little bit of herd immunity at the end. It was inevitable that we'd have to do some sort of herd immunity.
And it's kind of like, and so it's not, I mean, at the same time, the HSE is doing a vaccination push over Halloween. They're targeting, not using the word targeting, but they're basically trying to reach marginalised groups in particular, in terms of Roma, in terms of travellers. Also, interestingly enough, they said in terms of workplaces, and I think what they're talking about is meat plants, right? So say a lot of meat plants workers are coming from countries where there's a fair amount of vaccine hesitancy. Ideological, like Brazil, for instance, a lot of ideological vaccine hesitancy. It's probably a lot of Eastern European workers, the same sort of thing. Like there's very low rates in Romania, Poland's got low rates, whatever. So they're trying to reach those populations. They're also emphasising the 12 to 15-year-olds because there's only about 50% of those vaccinated. So there's the potential for more of them. That's the whole problem with the bad NIAC advice that suggested there was more of a risk of myocarditis than there was from COVID, which was wrong, and is now removed from the website, but they never made a deal out of saying, we got that one wrong.
Wow.
But, so there's also hope to roll the vaccine out, and they're saying they have already got a response to stepping stuff up during the week, in that they had about 1,000 dose ones a day on average for the previous couple of weeks, and the first couple of days of this push there were like 2,000, a bit over 2,000, so that's a bit of a result. Now we're down to about 390,000 who haven't been vaccinated. Right? So even 2,000, that's actually quite a big chunk.
Are we talking about adults here?
No, that's over 12. People over 12.
Over 12.
They keep saying the figure for 300,000 for adults, but I don't think that's right. I think they must be counting over 15 perhaps as adults, which, cause I think over 15s can make the decision on their own to get vaccinated. So maybe that's where that confusion is coming in.
Okay, right.
And actually, these numbers matter quite a lot when you're trying to work out outcomes. But anyway, that's what they're doing. Yeah. So there is a thing that so you try and reach the extra people. But if you can't reach them, what do you do? Do we stay locked up because we can't reach that, 6%, 8%, whatever it is, indefinitely? And so you can see why there's a sort of set of thinking, we can't do that. We're going to have to take the hit. This is going to happen anyway. So let's just go for it, right?
Yeah,
that's what driving a car at a wall. That seems to what it looks like. And so that
putting
seems
your foot
to be the
down
thinking.
on the accelerator.
Okay, so I can understand why that's happening.
Full gas.
I can understand why it's happening.
Yeah.
There's two problems. One is the health systems is in crisis now in terms of providing care for non-COVID things, right?
Yes.
The consequence of doing this now is that people will die not only of COVID but of other conditions. If you have a heart attack and an ambulance can't be found for 3 hours because they're all busy, that's going to be a bad outcome for you. If you have a car crash and there's no ICU available for you and you have to be transported by helicopter to Dublin, that's probably going to be a bad outcome for you. Strokes, there's got lots of elective surgeries going to be cancelled. About every single ICU bed taken up by COVID will result in 10 to 20 elective surgeries. Elective surgery sounds like it's plastic surgery or not. It's not. It's cancer surgery, it's heart surgery, it's any of those sort of things. They're going to have to be cancelled. All those mean that you'll get additional deaths, and we can see that from the Northern Irish figures, because they've been doing this since June, right? In order to get, they've a lower vaccination rate, so they've been trying to burn through to June. Although they're actually opening the nightclubs a week after us, and so they've had excess deaths above their COVID deaths for months now.
Yeah.
About 50% more than the actual COVID deaths. And presumably, I mean, we don't know for sure, but presumably that's what's actually going on. It's not that they're missing COVID deaths, it's that other people who need care aren't getting it fast enough or aren't getting it at all. So that's one element of what the problem is. The other element, though, is, as I said, the North's been doing this since June, and England's been doing it since earlier, right?
Yeah.
And it went
since
full throttle.
Freedom Day last.
Yeah. Well, they had that was in July, but they opened most stuff up in June, and then they opened the nightclubs and everything else in July. So they've been doing it since July.
Yeah,
it's not working.
It's plainly not working.
They're getting more cases. What they have had is a wave of hospitalisations and deaths since then. That's really substantial. The latest zero prevalence study of antibodies in the population. You can test for anti-S, which is antibodies to the spike protein, right? And that's very high in the British population. It's about, it's up towards 90% or above 90%, right? But that's mostly vaccination, right? Or you can test for antibodies to the nuclear capsid protein, which is anti-N, and that's only at 20%, right?
So sorry, there you'll have to explain these.
So basically, anti-N
so one is you've got the vaccine.
Anti-S is both vaccine and infection, right? Anti-N is infection only, right?
Okay,
because you don't make vaccine. There's reasons why you don't do vaccines for nuclear capsids.
Okay, so that's only at 20%, even though they've been letting it rip since June.
And
or July.
So the probable reason for that, and we kind of know this because quite a lot of people are now getting reinfected, is that immunity through infection doesn't last all that long. That the antibodies wane. You're probably left with memory cell protection, but probably not as much as you get actually from vaccination. There's some argument it might be broader, which would be good, but you don't. In other words, in terms of herd immunity, it probably makes a contribution for 3 months, and it might make a contribution for 6 months, but it probably doesn't do beyond that. So
so you can see where the problem lies.
You end up in a hamster wheel, right?
Yeah.
This may also be true of vaccination, by the way. So it may be that the only thing we're going to be able to do is get into a regime of vaccinating everybody every 6 months. It might be what will work is that we vaccinate everybody over 60 every 6 months, and the rest of us, infection acts as a kind of booster dose because we're at lower risk. They're the two choices. But it doesn't look, from what's happening in England, that you can simply get to population immunity to an infection.
You can't drive through it.
Because it's falling off at one end as you're putting it in the other end. And the other example of this in practice is Iran, right? Now, Iran, because of sanctions, was never really able to deal with COVID all that well. It limited their capacity. They gave up pretty early as well, in terms of the regime gave up. And it's also, geographically, it's at a crossroads, and it's at a crossroads where it's surrounded by other countries with high incidence. So it's just had wave after wave of COVID coming through. And their zero prevalence studies indicate that in some provinces in Iran, on average, the average person has now been infected 2.5 times. Right, so that's an average. So that probably means some people have managed to escape it altogether, but some have probably been infected 4 times or even 5 times. Right, that it's not that shocking a statistic in that while the existing common cold coronaviruses, there's 4 of them in circulation, and they think we get them sometime between every 6 months and every 2 years, right? That we get them quite frequently. So again, if you look at the UK figures, that's probably why they're at 20%. That 20% is probably the last 6 months. So it's not a good. It doesn't work to stop the infection circulating in society. That's the problem.
Okay, even before they decided, last week, or they decided not to stop, say, opening up. We already had hospitals, Limerick Hospital was effectively closed. It's already the case that we're not talking about this being a projection. It's actually happening right now. If you're outside, I don't know where, outside Sligo today, and you have a car accident, there's every possibility that you're going to end up being airlifted or possibly not getting into a hospital now because ICU's already at those sort of levels,
Yeah.
right? So in spite of all that, they still seem to go ahead with
Yeah.
it. So
Yeah, so, and as I was saying, that
what's the other side of this then? What was their options besides
this
obviously full gas? But
this is the problem we're in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, genuinely and realistically, this is the problem. We're in a situation where there is no longer an exit visible, right? Instead, people are starting to talk about 5 years of this or 10 years of this, at various levels. Now, so what the hope is, with the other hope of getting people infected or getting them vaccinated, is that if you survive and you get infected again, then maybe it won't be so severe. So maybe there won't be the same sort of demand on hospitalisation or ICU from, take that 400,000 people who will be infected. 399,000 of them will probably survive, and then they get infected, in 6 months to a year. So the question then is, well, if 1,000 of them die this time, will it be 1,000 the next time, or maybe it'll be 500, and then it'll be 250, and similar things for hospital demand, right? So that what you're kind of hoping is that goes off a cliff. The problem with that hope is, one, it's not visible in the British data. The levels of hospitalizations and stuff are still very high. It's similar in the north. You look at the northern stats, and most of the reduction in hospitalization seems to be down to the fact that that kids have made up a bigger element recently.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be anything else. So that seems to remain high. And Iran, again, the later waves seem to have a more rather than less severe effect, which could be explained by the fact that your first infection leaves some people weaker and less able to fight off a subsequent one.
Yes.
So actually, it's more severe. So it's not, like, I don't want to be too definitive about this and say that neither of these strategies can work, right? That Iran proves this or England proves that. They don't prove it.
Yeah.
But what they both strongly suggest is that you want to be quite cautious about thinking they work.
Of course, the other aspect of this is, I presume, obviously Iran doesn't have anything like the vaccination rates that we have, so like that's a caveat. The UK, I don't know what the UK is.
Oh, they've got high vaccination rates.
High vaccination rates as well, but they're with the other vaccination, whatever it is.
They're more dependent on AstraZeneca, but they've a lot of Pfizer as well. So it's not. I mean, there probably is an impact from AstraZeneca, but it's not the reason the pandemic is still going there. Basically, that's not what the difference is.
Okay, but this is the thing that's probably influencing it to a certain extent. It seems like it to me, because the words that you use there is that there's an exit is not visible.
Yeah.
That's kind of news to me.
Yeah.
And it's also a huge switch from we're getting back to normal, right?
No, exactly.
So,
and a few months ago, I thought, like in June, I thought we were exiting the pandemic, and even a month ago, I thought we were exiting, because I thought maybe this immunity to infection thing will, that will get the last bit. There'll be enough. It looked like the vaccines were suppressing transmission enough to keep it at a manageable level, and it's only really in the last 2 to 3 weeks it became clear that that's actually not the way it's actually going. And arguably, if we'd half of the remaining unvaccinated segment vaccinated, that would change it. Arguably, if vaccines are approved for 5 to 12-year-olds and half of them get vaccinated, maybe that changes the dynamic. So there's other things that can do it. Booster shots can do it. There are potential exits.
It's multifactorial.
It's become very much less certain, and I've noticed that an awful lot of the people who know what they're talking about are now talking about 5 to 10 years, right? And that's why. When I'm talking about examples, so. In terms of my own journey through this, because if people have been listening to these shows, this is a lot more negative than they would have been about potential exits, right? Yeah. So I've been kind of following the stats that were telling stories that weren't so great. Like Israel was the early indication of a problem, because they got a wave of COVID after they had an awful lot of people vaccinated.
Yeah, and they kind of basically had parties, and then they thought they were at the other end of it.
And we were people were looking at that, and they were going, well, maybe this is, there were reasons that we came up with that were quite credible for why this might be happening. Maybe some like you'd religious groups and stuff that weren't getting vaccinated at all. So people say, well, maybe that what's actually happened is it's just that the virus has now reached those groups and it's going through that.
Yeah,
but the
course,
vaccinated groups, it's not through. It's not happening through. Or maybe it's because they've a high proportion of children and there's a high adult vaccination, but it's just spreading through kids, and it's so people had reasons for why this might have been, and then there's been a kind of minority of people who are kind of much more negative about it and going, no, it's not working and this is why. And I was kind of going, I'm kind of aware of what's been said, but I hope they're wrong, and I hope what we're seeing here is that there's other reasons in this data for why this is going to work. Even though you can sort of say, well, if that's what's been said over there is right, then mightn't work, right? And in fact, what we would see maybe is what we're starting to see now. Although I don't think we're seeing waning impact yet. So it like basically and it's the problem with the pandemic. It's a new virus. We don't know how it will behave. The only way we find out is by trying to do stuff, and basically repeatedly in the last year, stuff that we thought was going to work has worked a bit, but hasn't been enough. And I think that's the critical position we've got now is the not enough. Now, there's one last thing I want to throw in, which is the other. There's a rather scary study which looks at the impact of a coronavirus on the population of Asia about 20,000 years ago, right? And it basically looks on the record, it leaves in genetics from then. Now, that might have been what's now one of our common cold coronaviruses, right? So it might be one of the ones that's in circulation, we get it, we don't even really notice it's annoying for a day or two, right? But the impact it had back then in terms of the genetic record it left was very substantial enough to leave a record in the first place. And it kind of looks like it might have had a big impact for hundreds of years, so across multiple generations. So that's the other.
So how do we know that information?
It's basically it's from it leaves the genetic markers left in these sort of situations that show there's population reductions and then passing on of particular
strains,
like a narrowing of genetic variability, basically. That's how. Like, I haven't read the paper in detail, but I noticed it last summer. I'm like, interesting.
Wow.
So
Jesus, it sounds more and more like we're in the middle of a really scary science fiction dystopian novel, doesn't it?
It keeps getting
like you're going like, how does this end?
If we didn't have the vaccines, we'd be in an enormously bad place. We thought the vaccines would get us out of it altogether, and instead it kind of looks like no, they've definitely made things a lot easier, but we're not going to have the easy exit we thought we had. It could be quite prolonged, and we may therefore need to have measures of various sorts for maybe quite a considerable period of time. And the important thing of that is that when you say that, people go, oh no, let's just take the hit, we want to get this over with. The problem is that the evidence that will actually work has considerably diminished. I mean, right from the start of the pandemic, there's been a minority who were like kind of, not enough people die, blah blah blah, just get everybody infected, then it'll be over with. It's pretty clear that doesn't work for multiple countries in terms of reinfection and severity of reinfection. There's probably a reduction happening there somewhere. To be honest, from that paper I talked about, that reduction could be eventually everybody who's susceptible genetically dies, which is obviously not what you want. It's not, in terms of any sort of reasonable way, it's not at all clear that the taking the hit, taking it on the chin approach, Freedom Day, Let It Rip, any of those variants will actually work, that they'll deliver, so that's the problem with it at the moment. And it's my problem with the current strategy is it feels like they've got kind of desperate and they've gone, there's nothing left we can do, so let's do this. And I've said this before, there is a problem with NPHET in that by nature it has to be quite a conservative body, so the science you consider and the medicine you consider has to be the stuff that's really well established, right, that there's good proof for. And the reason for that is, like, on the positive side, the reason for that is otherwise right at the start of the pandemic you might have chosen to believe the outliers who said, oh, it's only going to kill 700 people in the US and then it's going to end. So you might have gone, well, it's not worth worrying about. And then you might have believed the people who said, well, this study shows hydroxychloroquine is a miracle drug that'll save everybody, and so you might have gone for that. Nowadays we know that actually increased mortality by 10%, and then you might be ivermectin is the current sort of thing, so there's
I was only looking at that press conference where Trump was going like, if we shine a really intense light maybe on the inside
yeah,
or the
exactly
like,
so there's lots of research being published, and you could easily I want to select one particular set of research, and that's all the stuff I think is right, and we'll plough through it, and that'll work. That could be my point of view. And what I've done in the last bit is I've been talking about bits of research and things that apparently show, but these could be completely wrong. It may turn out in 6 months' time that actually, that 20,000 year ago has no relevance whatsoever to us. That the apparent effects in Israel and in England are due to some co-founding variables that are just reaching populations that we weren't previously infected, whatever. I mean, these look increasingly less possible as time passes.
Yeah.
But making big policy decisions on the basis of being definite about them is kind of maybe something you don't want to do until basically the ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Control, signs off it, because that's the way it works. Essentially, the ECDC puts out guidance, and then NPHET take the guidance and adopt it to a local situation. That's the way it's worked with the pandemic. And at times, that guidance isn't great. So early on, masks, be told, masks won't make a difference, don't bother with them. Guidance changes, then that comes out. That's the sort of place we're in. So it's not, in kind of going on this bit of a rant here, right? I'm not going in it from the point of view that there is an easy, obvious answer that they're ignoring, stupid or whatever else, right? I can kind of understand why the decisions that are being made partially out of desperation and partially because they're following a set of established beliefs which seem to be mostly based off experience of flu virus and flu pandemics that just simply may not hold very well for coronaviruses. Okay. That's the problem, basically.
I've got a theory, right? The theory being that it seems like this tactic is one that's very much influenced by our current set of thinking. And what I mean by that is that in terms, it doesn't come as any surprise that, Boris Johnson has the let it rip theory, right?
Yeah.
Let it rip theory is fine because what happens is people will die. Most of the time, it's not going to be me. At least he thinks that, right? Because they've been protected in the past and they've got population vaccinated and everything else, and then that's a cost that we pay because what's important, business returns to normal, we get through this, we drive through this wall and we get back to markets functioning, the economy is healthy, everything else. So it's a price worth paying, and they've been making those decisions since day one because capitalism views humans as resources. So let's just burn through some resources. The problem is that you do that and then you don't get to the other side, or that you actually tell people that you are going to get through this, you are going to come through an exit, but actually then suddenly you're in the war room and you're starting to see, actually, I don't know, this doesn't look so good, but you know what, we don't have any other options. So it becomes the policy of desperation. And that seems, or it certainly feels like from this perspective, that they're locked into this and they now can't seem to get out of it, even to the extent of the proper decision would have been to not open the nightclubs or whatever, right? And on that basis, then you would have to explain to people that the normalization theory, the exit was, not possible because, it looks like. And you would also have to explain to people, well, how are we going to get out of this? Because, you've sold us the lie before. So what happens now? And and they don't have the answers. So that's probably the main thing in terms of, because...
Yeah, I'd object to the sold us the lie before, because I think they genuinely believed that either through vaccination or a combination of vaccination and infection that they would bring the pandemic to an end. I think when Boris went off on that nonsense in July, he actually thought the expectation was that it would work. The problem at the current phase is that because they set off on that, actually it's quite a big deal to admit it didn't work, because the cost of it in human
people,
terms
yeah,
is quite
huge
considerable.
people, yeah. But the lie that I was talking about more so was last Christmas. The lie that we could still just open up for Christmas,
Right,
and
yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like. And
The idea that it could be safe.
yeah,
basically.
pretty much, and they seem to be saying exactly the same thing, because they can't go back on the fact that this is an exit wave, because it's not an exit wave. It doesn't look like it. It's certainly not beginning to feel like an exit wave now.
Yeah.
So rather than having to explain to everybody that all the cost that we've already gone through hasn't actually got us to the point where we're actually coming out of this, it's just too difficult for them to deal with. And I think this seems like, or feels like, very much like a Hail Mary pass. Let's just maybe we'll do it, maybe we'll get through because we've got huge levels of vaccination, whatever. Like it all sounds very desperate. That's what it
Yeah,
sounds
I mean,
like.
and the second problem that we have to deal with as a society is that because the impact of COVID is so asymmetrical, i.e. it basically kills old people and vulnerable people, and because, if you're an 18 to 24-year-old who believes they're healthy, it probably won't do anything to you. And you're probably right, you're wrong in a few cases. Once you're vaccinated, you're pretty much certainly right. I mean, there's virtually nobody who believes they're healthy and has been vaccinated and who's anywhere probably under 50 that's ending up in ICU, maybe even under 60.
Oh, is there those figures still holding? I wanted to ask that as well, about like the 2/3.
It's still
in ICU
it's
are
about
unvaccinated.
Yeah, it's about 2/3 in August and September of people in ICU were unvaccinated.
Okay, right. Yeah. So that's true.
So I mean, the vaccines are definitely working.
There is at least there is some sort of like concrete evidence that we can point to that's reassuring.
No, and that's what I mean.
Way.
I mean, I think I probably didn't emphasize that enough, but I did say at some point earlier on that if it wasn't for the vaccines, we'd be in a truly terrible place. As it is, they're doing quite a good job of pulling down deaths, hospitalizations, and ICU usage. So from that point of view, they're working.
Yeah.
The problem is more that because Delta is so infectious, it reaches so many people so quickly that even that 95% protection is 5% not protected turns out to be quite a big number. That's the problem we face. Now, in terms of that, so the social cohesion thing, so like if there isn't an obvious, we're waiting to do this, so we're waiting to get people vaccinated, I think that was an easy argument to explain to people, say in June and July, right? Let's not do this prematurely. It's going to be another couple of months. Let's hold off till we've got everybody who wants to be vaccinated.
Let's get it right. Let's get everyone through
that
the
done.
safe.
And actually, to be fair, that's what we did. We held off. There was, we opened outdoor hospitality, then we eventually opened indoor hospitality with certs, and that essentially worked at the level of keeping cases static or even going down. So that worked. If we hadn't done that, then all summer we'd probably been much more Northern Ireland with at least twice as many cases and 5 to 6 times as many deaths. Right? That's not what we did. So now that we are where we are now, it's a much hard. I mean, the ongoing restrictions are a much harder thing to sell, right? There's a point, and what's central to what's happening now is the problem is that once the hospitals get really hard hit, then you run out of options, right? But it probably is much harder to convince people that you're going to run out of options in a month's time. That it does perhaps, from the point of view of public opinion, there's more of a need to actually for the crisis to be created before people are willing to act to stop the crisis, because they want to believe it's not going to happen. I've been arguing with idiots on Twitter all week about this, where they're just like they're going, but it's not possible. Everybody's vaccinated. How could this be?
But Andrew, do you like? I mean, Twitter is the home for idiots. I mean, like
Facebook too. So
that's where you're going to find them.
So there's a whole coherence problem, because the reason our public health measures worked as well as they did was basically because of coherence. People bought into them. It was a collective struggle. It wasn't. It wasn't because the guards were having roadblocks or whatever else. Right?
I was only writing this the other day when we were talking about, like, because if you would have said the word solidarity to somebody, you'd probably have to be 50 before you'd actually know that it was probably something to do with. You might even think, if you're political, that it's something to do with a union that brought down communism in Poland, right? That's how like sort of dated the term was. And then suddenly on the radio it was like social solidarity, and we're in this together and everything else, like so that's very obvious that like we had to go through that phase, and cohesion is the only way. Social cohesion was the only way that you would get that, and they've got that. But they're now in an invidious position because
and what we got out of that,
like they're going to have to say to people, we did all that, but we still can't get out of this.
Yeah, thing. And so what we got out of that, just so that's understood, is we at this point we've about 1/2 to 1/3 of the death rate in other European countries. Right? Yeah. So that's quite there's a big achievement there that's worth going. That was well done.
Yeah.
And now we're in the situation that I talked about, where basically the problem is the most vulnerable section of the population are still pretty vulnerable to COVID. Booster doses might give them some protection, but it won't. Like in particular, say cancer patients, anybody who's anybody who's got a transplant, anybody who's over probably 80. 85, definitely any of those groups, you're still talking about very substantial mortality, and vaccination having some impact on that, but it's limited and will need booster doses and all the rest. And so you're looking at, I mean, my question, for instance, with the 95% protection of vaccines, will that turn out actually to be 95% a year as people get older, rather than 95% for the entire population for the rest of their life? So in other words, every year will we see 2,000 to 3,000 deaths from COVID? Quite possibly. I'm going to say that in a few shows. And it's clear that there's a growing section of the population frustrated with, being stuck under measures for so long, inclined to believe the people who tell them if we just take a hit it will go away. So that there's an ideological current to people there saying that. That are kind of going, well, I've done what you asked me to. 17 months on, I can't live like this any longer. Best years of my life, etc., etc. And plus, in the last couple of months, they'd NPHET and the HSE and the government telling them it was over. And so you saw, obviously lots of pubs stopped checking vaccine surge. You got all those sort of changes, which created where we are at the moment. And it's not like there's an easy. That's the other thing when I say I don't.
Like the other thing that nobody who's that's the question. Then even if you, and this is probably what really needs to happen, is somebody actually has the honest conversation and says, look, this is what we thought was going to happen. It's not what's going to happen, and somebody has to have some sort of plan. But what is the plan? You see, because beyond. I can't see the only the way I could see this unfurling.
There's no plan that's not quite unpalatable. That's basically
but that's what I mean.
Is.
But do you wait until the inevitable crisis hits, which is looking like a month, and then you go to people and say, actually, lads, we don't have the healthcare system to deal with this, so we're going to have to lock down again, or we're going to have to. I don't know what the plan is, because I don't know how it would work on that basis. And taking the hit is not going to get us out the other side of this. It's just going to lead to more deaths. I mean, it's very hard to see the best spin doctor in the world, how you're going to put a positive spin on that. Even though you might say, like, the way we've come through it, we have the lowest death count in Europe and everything else.
No, it's not the lowest, but it's
one of the lower ones, yeah. But if you have that, and then at the same time, in the same breath, you have to explain to people that it's not going to be return to normal. It's not going to be the exit that you think it is. So that's the dilemma they're facing. So what do you say? What can be done, or is it just a case of we just have to wait for the wheels to totally come off at the end of November?
So my objection with the whole nightclub thing and the way it's been done is in fact not even so much that they're opening them. I get the reasons why that's happening. I think for the reasons I've outlined, it would probably be hard not to do that. It's more that it's been done. First of all, they've lied to people by telling them it can be done safely. That's not the case. That's kind of just rubbish. And secondly, they've done it in this way with the setting it up to blame people because it's all personal responsibility. You know, somehow being careful about buying your drink at the bar at 2:00 in the morning is going to magically stop this going on. You know, like that's there's no way that isn't just ludicrous gaslighting, whatever you want to call it. You know, so that's my problem. And then, as I said, the other problem is that the timing of this is when it's very clear the health service was going to go into crisis anyway because the rate of case increase.
Yeah.
Now, I think maybe the thinking behind the timing, and this might be true, is that that this peak was going to happen anyway unless we brought in restrictions. Right. You know, so we'd have to actually maybe shut down hospitality indoors or something, and in winter that's more or less shutting it down in order to get cases under control, because otherwise cases were going to continue doing what they've been doing, which is growing slowly. And instead of having a peak in November, we'd have it in December, and we'd have the problem of all the Christmas mixing and blah blah blah. Yeah. And a December peak therefore could be a lot worse than a November one. Again, and that probably works in the short term, because even if immunity from infection does fade, if everybody gets infected in the next month, then it's still good for December or January maybe, you know. So that in terms of that strategy, and I suspect this is what the strategy is, even though it's not really been spelled out, except if you're paying careful attention to the shapes of the graphs at the press conference, and you're going, right, okay, that's kind of interesting there.
That's where your peak is.
That's probably what's going on in the background, but it's not like anybody's come out and explained that.
But even like let's play this all the way through. Let's go through the peak in November. Where does that leave us? I mean, a health system in total crisis, in disarray, infection rates hugely substantial, breakthrough infections in the 85-year-olds, more people dying. Yeah. And is the plan that we get to there, and then suddenly the people who are going to die from this die anyway, and we're able to, like, you see, this is the problem. This is the problem with I think the way our understanding of it has changed, in that a year ago lots of people would have seen it that way, right? Now there's a lot more going, you know, with immunity against infection waning, and there is some carry-on hit to that in terms of hospitalisation and stuff, you know, because the really good numbers we got early on were really good numbers because a lot of people were also not getting infected. If there's a much higher set of people getting infected at the moment, I think I mentioned this in the last show, we're looking at at the moment about 4 per 1,000 people end up in ICU in terms of cases, right? And if half of those are unvaccinated, and if getting infected turns out to be as effective as being vaccinated as future protection, probably won't be, but if it was, then you end up at about 2 per 1,000 going to ICU, which is still, and the problem is that's still a really big number. It doesn't sound very big, but with 1 million people, that's 2,000 or whatever going to ICU. That's what the problem. That's where our problem is basically. That's and our understanding of what's likely to happen in the future is that any interventions you do, because of that problem with waning immunity, what that means is that your pool of people who aren't immune in the population gets larger. So the danger is that by using interventions now to prevent a peak at this point, means that instead you get a much bigger peak it's not
in a couple of months' time.
That's the problem.
And so what the end of the pandemic starts to look like, basically, is a sequence of peaks that you're hoping get smaller and less severe until they eventually peter out. That's kind of what that looks like. And then the tools we have to interrupt that are basically getting more people vaccinated. That's the number one tool. That changes because half the people in ICU are unvaccinated. You get half them vaccinated.
2/3
then
of people.
You take a quarter of the people who are currently going in, go out of the equation, and instead of having 90 in ICU today, you have 68 or whatever, you know. So that clearly helps. Booster doses, with the most vulnerable populations, in terms that probably gives them another 3 months protection or 6 months protection or whatever, right? That's the thinking there. So that they're the people who are most likely to die or end up in hospital. Problem with that, of course, is there's a global shortage of vaccines. So what that basically means is we're now taking booster doses for our most vulnerable populations that aren't going to vulnerable populations elsewhere in the world.
Totally,
Healthcare
yeah,
with.
yeah,
So the whole moral thing around that's a bit of a disaster. But that,
morals has gone out the window a long
yeah,
time
and
ago
that's
in
all
this
to do
system.
with protecting patents and
Ethics and
all that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
that's kind of, I think, where we are at the moment, which is this very, there's just this set of bad choices. So what you kind of tell everybody they have to get vaccinated. So you force that last 8% to get vaccinated.
Well,
do you
I know
bring in more measures? Do you shut things down again to keep it up? Do you just decide you're going to accept debts? I mean, that's your decision triangle, basically. And in fact, none of those three is even complete anyway. None of those three. It's not like you can choose one and it fixes the problem.
No, that's what I mean. Like you do all this. Like I noticed in some of the countries, like Italy now, you can't go, but you have to be vaccinated to go back to work. So that they're now dealing with it in that way, and you could do something similar here.
Yeah.
So like there is other options, but the thing is, you can do any of these things, but you can't. There's such is the level of uncertainty that there's no guarantee that that's gonna actually get you to what the promised land, which is an exit out of it. Like, I mean, we still don't know if you do all this stuff at the end of November, what happens then?
Right, so yeah, exactly. That's the problem. With our current vaccines, right, there isn't an exit. Now, maybe we get better vaccines, right, although that process is liable to take a while. Maybe more people do get vaccinated because they realise that actually they don't want to go to ICU and the risk for them is quite substantial, and that the various conspiracy theories they've been fed are rubbish. Or actually, they just reached and people have conversations with them. I mean, the behaviour unit, which has been doing regular polling, said that from what they can tell, really what the people who aren't vaccinated, what they can tell are people who don't really follow the news very much. They tend to be people who they're not informed. So it's not necessarily people believing Facebook conspiracy theories. It's more just they don't, so they found, for instance, that when they were doing recent polling, that people couldn't tell them what the benefits of vaccination were. Right. So there wasn't an understanding of that. So, reaching groups that explains that, that can help push it up. Better antivirals would help, and that's more realistic in the short term, I think, because that means that although people get infected and get sick, they're in hospital for shorter periods of time and fewer of them die. So that's so there are various things that can help like that. There's some non-pharmaceutical interventions that aren't a pain in the ass, basically, right? So obviously shutting down hospitality or telling us we can't go more than 2 kilometers from the house, that's a pain in the ass, right? We kind of want to avoid that insofar as is possible completely. Telling people that to wear masks on public transport, that's a bit of a pain in the ass, but it's not, on the grand scheme of things.
I think it's pretty minor.
That's pretty minor. And so one of the things you could do is say, look, rather than the cloth masks, let's get everybody to wear N95 masks. So they're the kind of duckbill ones, because they're better, actually quite a lot better at preventing both people catching COVID and transmitting it. And Germany has done that, and a couple of other countries. Now, Germany, for instance, I'm not saying it's due to that alone, but they've certainly... Their cases are staying static and much lower, right? So that's one possibility. You could, one that everybody was fighting about is antigen testing. You could have more widespread antigen testing, which I understand what they're afraid of. In those terms, that people will be symptomatic and won't get tested, and either they'll
do it badly themselves.
No, exactly. They'll have swabbed themselves badly and they'll think they're grand or whatever. There needs to be an education campaign around all that sort of stuff as well. But particularly when people are vaccinated, and they're kind of admitting this themselves now, because they're now going to start. If you're vaccinated and you're a close contact, they're going to send you a pack of antigen tests, and you're meant to do one every 2 days, 3 times. Basically, and they're hoping to pick up some cases that way. So that's admitting that vaccinated people can catch COVID and can transmit it, which is true. It's just less likely. But also seeing a wider value in at-home antigen testing. So that's another thing. But actually, then there's stuff that, as far as you and me concerned, isn't a nuisance at all, right? Ventilation is by far the most obvious of these, and it's interesting because where I work, it's one of the things they've really rolled out. So that you can literally feel we'd a lot of stuffy rooms,
yeah.
and now you go into some of those stuffy rooms and you can feel the air being sucked out of them. You know, in terms of you or me, there's no cost to that whatsoever. Apart from going, oh, this room seems a bit ventilated, there's no cost. In fact, there's probably a health benefit in that. It means you're less likely to get colds and flus, and helps with pollution. So there's also kind of, they're not zero cost because somebody's paying for that.
Somebody will have to. Yeah.
But they're not that expensive, you know, and all that would help dampen down the rate at which cases would spread and kind of buy time. And you know, that would help. Well, probably, I think from looking at people trying to model that might give you a 25% reduction in cases in any year, which is quite significant. So it's not like it's going to go away. But that's the problem we're at is kind of there's a growing need to break with the traditional model of how a disease like this might work and the way it might die down. The evidence for that needs to accumulate. There's the problem of society as a whole losing its cohesion for legitimate reasons, that the actual risks have become...
I feel like losing my shit right now.
Yeah. Focused in a particular sector. You've the problem of politicians basically making decisions because of lobbying and bribes and all that sort of stuff going on.
Interest,
You've the problem of the vested interests themselves, cherry picking research subconsciously as much as consciously that seems to be favourable and tells them everything will be grand, you know, and you've all that, and so we find ourselves in this point where large parts of the pandemic, it was clear what needed to be done. You still had cranks who didn't want to do that, but it was clear what needed to be done, so people got together and they did it. Where we are now, the problem is that clarity doesn't exist. It's clear there's going to be a cost to path one at the moment, even if, you know, the cranks are the ones trying to pretend there isn't a cost. We all understand there's going to be a cost, but there's quite big divisions about what and if anything should be done around that.
Wow.
That's where we are.
That's very sobering. That's been a very sobering show. You just love to get some clarity about it. It just feels like we're in such an uncertain time. Good. Well, anyway, I'm really glad that I now understand. It's kind of outlined.
That's where I think we are. I could be wrong on any one of those.
I know,
it's possible,
but thankfully,
my fear is I'm not.
Thankfully, I don't think you are. I mean, I really do feel like that we're in the situation we're in now because there's a desperation for everybody for this to be over, and that's not the best way to make decisions because it's totally emotional and very little rational thinking going behind it.
You know, and the thing is, for a lot of us, in terms of personal risk, it is kind of over. You know, I kind of still don't fancy getting COVID, to be honest, but I'm not. You know, I'm not really making decisions anymore on the basis of whether or not that's a significant risk. You know, I'm more going, is that thing I want to do going to be enough fun that I'm willing to take the risk in terms of doing it? You know, that's kind of more what the equation is. And lots of people are doing that. You know, and so we're probably, the risk calculation you're doing is much more about, well, if I do that, then how can I control my exposure to other people in the time period afterwards? Again, antigen testing might be a useful sort of thing like that, you know.
But what I'm thinking about here and more is the context on a societal level. Yeah. How does society get to the situation where we can, people want to get back to normal, and we're now beginning to realise that journey is going to be longer than we anticipated, but you want people to be informed about that so that you don't totally lose all the solidarity by deceiving people or even worse, by doing something like trying to pass on the responsibility to people themselves. You know, so that's the real.
So the one thing actually I should mention is as I said, I don't have a problem as such with the nightclub decision. I have a problem with the way it's been presented. I actually do have one problem though with it, which is that there's too much of it is driven by the economics of it.
Oh yeah,
And in particular, the idea that basically they're opening at full capacity, because that doesn't make sense in terms of
nothing else opened up at full capacity, like all the stadiums, all the football, and everything. That's happening outdoors.
I'm sure that's because they're saying it'll be impossible to actually make money unless we're allowed to open at full capacity. And then there's got to be a question of, well, okay, can we continue a subvention to the industry that basically says, okay, you can open but at half capacity, whatever else. But we're still willing. What we're going to do is we're going to fund that.
Yeah.
Or whatever, there's stuff like that. So there's kind of like the problem is they've done this pretense that it's a safe opening.
Yeah,
but that's
obviously not true.
The only aspect that probably has some impact is if they actually enforce it, is the vaccine certificates to get in, right? Because that will reduce the size of any outbreaks that come out of it and the frequency of them.
Yeah.
It won't stop it, but it will, so that might have some impact. Although, from it's pretty obvious from pubs and restaurants that they just stopped checking. Now, maybe that happened in the context of everybody going, this is almost over. So you're kind of going, well, if it's going to be over in 2 weeks, just whatever.
But somebody has to grasp the nettle in relation to that. It's not almost over.
Yeah.
And we have to start making decisions on the basis that this is going to be a lot longer.
And you can also do stuff like you can have requirements about ventilation of spaces. Yeah. And again, if need be, you can subsidise what the cost of doing that might be. You can have inspection regimes that check that rooms are adequately ventilated. You don't necessarily, but I think we know from long experience here that you don't, like the Mica scandal, you don't want to have the same people certifying something that are actually doing it themselves. So that there is actually genuine things that could be done that would reduce the risk. And in terms of what we're talking about, because this is the thing, I think there has to be a return, and people have to feel we're returning as close as normal as we can get. Right.
Yeah.
But the problem at the moment is that's being done on the pretense that this won't create a problem, or that the problem will only be short term, where it much more needs to be, we're going to try and do that. We can't do absolutely everything. So there's going to be some stuff, and this may go on for a while, that we're going to have to limit capacity. Else. We may need test regimes. We need, people have to prove they're vaccinated. Any of those things. Yeah. That has to kind of get a bit, be established really as the way of doing things until we find the better long-term solutions, whether it's better vaccines, better antiviral, better detection. Maybe it does turn out that once we've all been infected 2 or 3 times, that actually it just is a common cold.
Yeah. But all these decisions seem to be still based on the basis that we break through the wall, we get to the exit, and then we get into the economic, wonderland of everybody going back to making, businesses coming back to normal and everything else. And it's mostly done on the basis of we take the hit and then we get to we're still enslaved into the system of the markets and the economy and everything else. And it's just, that's the problem. The environment that these decisions are made in is totally lopsided. The people, again, are the least concerned in terms of what actually the impacts on them. So totally arse about face. Perfect. Okay, thank you, Andrew.
All right.
Thanks.